Hey guys, Ben from Beck Photography here, and today we are looking at how to take stunning band photos. So last weekend I was hired by a friend of mine to shoot a place called Northern Sound System, which is where they put on a whole bunch of local shows and also a whole bunch of big shows as well. So the first thing I like to do when I get into the venue is I go have a chat with the lighting guy. The lighting guy at this venue is really chilled out, and he lets me sort of ask him if I can, have lighting in certain ways, and he always says, sure man, no problem, which is really nice. If you are able to have a chat with the lighting guy and sort of dictate what lights he's going to have on and what color lights he's going to have on, my first tip would to be ask for a bit of white front light on the stage. Having a whole bunch of white light on the stage is really going to neutralize the color, especially on the musician's face, and this is really going to help in post when you're trying to get skin tones right and things like that. There's nothing worse than having a whole bunch of reds or a whole bunch of blues just smashing the musician's face and then not being able to produce nice colored skin and having a normal color balance in the image. The next thing I like to do is just have a chat with the musicians that I'm shooting and see if there's any particular photos they're looking for. A good thing to also ask the band is where you can stand. Now, a lot of bands, especially in small venues and at local shows, a lot of the bands will let you get on stage if you want to get a photo of the drummer and things like that. Obviously, you should always ask the musicians before they play if you're allowed to do this, and sometimes it's not possible, but sometimes they'll allow you to hop onto the side of the stage just to get a photo of the drummer. Now, at this venue I didn't have to do that because I can get behind the stage and shoot the drummer from behind there. It's always nice to get a whole bunch of good shots of drummers and really focus on drummers when you're shooting music, because they're always the people that don't get very many photos because they're at the back. It's often very difficult to get to them, so make sure you don't neglect the drummer. Anyway, the equipment I used was a Sony a7R II for the camera body. I had a Tamron 24-70 2.8 attached to that body, and that's it. Here's one of the photos I took from the night. It's not my favorite image, but I did an interesting editing process for this photo that I wanted to share with you guys. The settings I used for this photo was aperture of 2.8, shutter speed of 1/50th of a second, and an ISO of 2000. The reason I chose this aperture was because with music photography I find that I need to use the lowest aperture I can possible, because a lot of music venues I go to are very darkly lit. The reason I used a shutter speed of 1/50th of a second was because the vocalist in this photo was moving around a little bit and I didn't want any motion blur, but also I needed to have quite a slow shutter speed just so I can get enough light into my sensor to produce a well exposed image. Which brings me to ISO. The reason I used ISO of 2000 was just so I could get a perfectly exposed image with the two previous settings I discussed, and I didn't want to bump the shutter speed up any higher and have to go to 4000 ISO or even higher, so that's the reason I chose 2000 ISO. So let's get right into the editing. The first thing I did was boost the exposure because the whole photo was a bit underexposed, and then I changed the saturation of the reds a little bit higher because the lights were looking a little bit pink, and then I also changed the saturation of the yellows as well to get some of those lights popping a little bit better. Then I dropped the highlights of the overall image just because I thought some of the whites were clipping a little bit too harshly, especially on the lights. I boosted the exposure up a little bit more just because I thought it wasn't quite bright enough. Dropped the whites a bit because it was clipping on his face. Messed around with the shadow slide a little bit until I got a nice black on his t-shirt without clipping any of the shadows, and then I boosted the vibrance of the whole image like that. Next thing I did was I just brightened up his face a little bit because it seemed a little bit flat. There wasn't very much highlight and shadow going on, so I just sort of adjusted the exposure tool and added some light here and there where I thought was appropriate. The next thing I did was add a bit of clarity to the parts of the image I wanted to pop the most, so his hands, his arm and his face as well. And then I sharpened those parts of the image as well just to make them more detailed looking and more in focus looking as well. After that I increased the saturation of those areas just a little bit, just to make them a bit more bold, and that was it for Camera Raw and into Photoshop. The first thing I did in Photoshop was just filter and despeckle. So that pretty much just got rid of all the noise in the shadow areas of the photo, like his t-shirt. Then I made a selection of Rory, the vocalist, and then went to Select, Inverse, and added Filter, Blur, Gaussian Blur 3 pixels, and then just moved over the selection a little bit so there wasn't any hard lines, and continued to blur until I was happy with the amount of blur in the background. And that was just to make Rory pop a little bit more from the image, so the focus of the image is more directed towards him. Next thing I did was I grabbed the sharpening tool and just added a little bit more sharpness to his eyebrows and a little bit to his eyelashes as well, just to make those parts of his face stand out a little bit more, and that was pretty much it for Photoshop. So here's the final image. I hope you like it. For the keen-eyed of you watching this video, you may have noticed that Rory's right hand looks different in the final image at the start of this video when compared to the original image, and that's because I actually gave him a hand transplant in the photo, but I didn't want to add an explanation on how I did that just because it would make the video 20 minutes long. So I've just put a time lapse of me changing his hand at the end of this video. If it interests you, have a look at it, and thank you very much for watching. Please subscribe if you did enjoy it. There's going to be more videos coming out every week, probably 2 or 3 every week. And also, if you learned something, please give this video a like. It really helps out a lot. And see you next time.